This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Did you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
Hey, strangers, if you're a fan of this podcast, I think you might enjoy mine as well. Strange and Unexplained with me, Daisy Egan, covers aliens to the Zodiac and everything in between with a heavy dose of side-eye. If you like unsolved mysteries but wish it came with a little more salt, Strange and Unexplained is your kind of podcast. Check it out now in its 4th season wherever you get your podcasts. And you can check us out early and ad-free on my very own Patreon network, patreon.com/grabbagcollab. Stay strange.
Strangers. As you might imagine based on the title of this episode, we cover the topics of death and dying in this story. So discretion might be advised for our youngest listeners. I'm Laurah Norton, and this is One Strange Thing, the show where we search the nation's news archives for stories that can't quite be explained. Richmond, Virginia is known for many things, both contemporary and historical, but one of particular interest to us as students of the strange is the Hollywood Cemetery. Most cities have a famous cemetery or two, and if they were designed in the 19th century, when the garden style was in fashion, a loved one could be laid to rest in what amounted to a beautiful public park, among trees and benches and fountains. These cemeteries encourage visitors and leisurely strolls and even picnics. It might seem foreign when you imagine graveyards full of uniform monuments or lonely little fenced-off alcoves where we might quietly visit and then leave, where graves might even be overgrown. Not at Hollywood Cemetery, where the landscape is scrupulously attended and locals are always welcome. And that was always the plan since its inception in 1847. According to the official website, quote, landscape architect John Notman specifically left trees and other plants untouched when designing the cemetery's landscape in order to create a peaceful haven for Richmonders. In fact, Hollywood Cemetery is even an official, accredited arboretum, which is a real thing, we checked, due to the incredible number of trees on the property. It's even named for the famous stand of holly trees that grow there. Unlike Hollywood in LA, where there was no preponderance of holly at all, Tinseltown was christened as such because holly brings good luck, or so the story goes. At the cemetery, things are more literal and more beautiful, at least we think. But it's not just that intentional, lovely design that makes Hollywood Cemetery a remarkable resting place for Richmond's departed. A number of our country's most esteemed citizens, including President James Monroe, they're buried there. Per the official website, there are even tours that take sightseers to visit all the monuments and graves of note. Now, if we've sounded so far like a tourist website, that's only because we failed to mention another major draw: all of the paranormal goings-on that have attracted a different kind of attention through the years. As the website Richmond Haunts describes, quote, the spirits of Confederate soldiers, workers doomed to a treacherous fate, a ghost dog, and even a vampire are known to haunt the Hollywood Cemetery. That's more than we could cover in several podcast episodes, but this episode will focus on 2 of those tales. And we'll start with that dog. Everyone loves a dog, right? Dogs, they're loyal companions, both in this life and in the next. The Iron Dog, or the Black Dog of Hollywood Cemetery, is perhaps the most famous statue on the property. Yet the official website only offers a brief description of the monument. Quote, one of the most well-known monuments in Hollywood Cemetery is a cast-iron Newfoundland dog. The statue stands guard over the grave of a little girl who died in 1862. The website also mentions that, quote, there are many stories about how the Iron Dog came to be in Hollywood Cemetery, including the most popular version that it was moved there to keep it from being melted down into bullets during the Civil War. But it's not just a little girl, and it's not just a dog. The story is much more specific and much sadder, and, if you believe local lore, more haunting than that. According to ABC8, the grave is that of Florence Bernadine Reese, who died of scarlet fever on February 7, 1862. That much is backed up by an obituary that ran in a local paper. Her father Thomas was a photographer, and little Florence moved often during her short life, as her father sought a better life for his wife and child. They lived in Kentucky, Pennsylvania, and finally in Richmond, Virginia, where her Uncle Charles resided with his own family. Thomas and his wife hoped it would be a providential move, but just over a year later, they lost Florence to the fever. It wasn't long after that her cousin Edward, Charles's son, also died of scarlet fever, and both children were buried in a family plot at Hollywood. Per ABC8, Florence's grave was the only one in the Reese family section to be designed in the cradle style, an ornamental design that was then popular for very young children. And near it stood a large, well-cast iron dog, which seemed to look alertly over the grave of Florence, and perhaps over the grave of her cousin Edward, too. How exactly the statue got there, though, that is a bit of a mystery. But that's not what most attracted visitors. It's not clear to us precisely when the story emerged, but locals began to claim that when they entered the cemetery, the dog didn't remain wholly statue-like. Rather, despite the fact that it absolutely shouldn't be able to do anything but sit there, it seemed to be taking its guard role seriously. According to the Daily News Leader, some began to claim that the statue would, quote, growl at anyone who intends to harm the little girl. Now, who would want to possibly disturb the grave of a child is beyond our imagining, but maybe the iron dog was simply feeling protective, and the approach of anyone who was too curious was enough to set off its ire. And there is something else. Per haunts of Richmond, many locals claim that they've heard a dog's barks echo throughout the cemetery, even when none was in sight, as they, quote, approached Florence's grave. They also claim that the statue moves. Some visitors find, quote, that the dog is facing them as they walk past it one way, and facing them again as they walk back in the opposite direction. Florence's dog is ever vigilant, watching over that cradle grave, no matter which way the visitors might go. Of course, there's absolutely no way to prove this, or to precisely explain why the dog was placed at Florence's resting place. We found several different theories posited in local newspapers, but some reporters also claimed that her name was Elizabeth and that she died somewhere between 1860 and 1890, so the depth of their research is questionable. However, there are historians who have truly tried to discover the truth. One is Bob Olson, who worked with ABC8 to research the Reese family. Olson thinks that it's most likely that, quote, Florence, as well as her cousin Edward, were fond of the iron dog in life. And he suspects that Florence's uncle Charles procured it for her and for his son Edward to guard over their graves in death. Apparently, Olson, he was able to trace the make and model of that statue, and he thinks it was possible, or even probable, that that big iron dog had once stood outside a local store. According to Olson's interview with ABC8, quote, as this particular tale goes, the statue sat outside of a Richmond business, and when the children passed it, they would play on the statue, clearly fond of it. And, says Olson, the practical purpose of adding it to the family plot is that it would have, quote, prevented the statue from being taken by Confederate soldiers for its raw materials. Now, cast iron would not have been appropriate for bullets, despite the popular story, but the metal could have been used for other weaponry. As Haunts of Richmond explains, quote, during the Civil War, the Confederate government was confiscating cast iron from many families, and in many places, even church bells were not spared. Whether or not that story is true, and if people are simply imagining that a great iron dog has taken on the role of supernatural protector, it's a nice thought in its way. The idea that love and guardianship can be transferred forever. it's certainly a gentler story than another of Hollywood cemetery's most famous legends. That of the Richmond Vampire, a creature that's said to stalk the grounds. This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Did you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
This is it. Your moment. This is your time to make your comeback with Purdue Global. When you come back with a Purdue Global degree, you create opportunity for yourself, your family, and your future. It's a degree you can be proud of, a degree that employers will trust and respect. Purdue Global offers working adults like you over 175 flexible degree programs to meet your specific career goals. These include associate, bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees and certificates. Purdue Global degree programs range from nursing to business to communication and more. Whatever your interest, we have the degree that will move you forward. You have the knowledge, you have the experience. Now it's time to get credit for the work you've done and earn the recognition you deserve with Purdue Global, Purdue's online university for working adults. You know you're worth it. We do too. So don't wait another second to get the degree that will take your career to the next level. Start your comeback today at purdueglobal.edu.
Now, about that vampire. It's a strange legend loosely tied to a mausoleum at the cemetery, that of a man named W.W. Poole. According to Richmond Magazine, his full name was William Wortham Poole, and he died in 1922. An odd fact is that his mausoleum simply has the date 1913 inscribed upon it, along with his name, W.W. Poole. There's no date of birth, and that's not the date that he died, not according to his obituary or census records. We admit that is a bit odd, but according to Find a Grave, his wife Alice had passed away in 1913. Perhaps the tomb had originally been meant for them both. We can't say for sure, but Mrs. Poole was buried separately with her own marker, and the date on Mr. Poole's mausoleum was never changed. Based on Richmond Magazine's research, the only strange thing about Poole's death was that he passed away of pneumonia on the same day as another prominent citizen, his friend Samuel R. Owens. Quote, "The occasion of their dual demises and the ceremonies following nearly shut down the city." But we don't see that as nefarious, just notable. In life, Mr. Poole was apparently an accountant. He's also sometimes described as a bookkeeper, but he was certainly a man of numbers who lived nearly into his 80s. In death, well, an accountant is probably not the likeliest person to inspire rumors of vampirism. And yet, the stories have crept up around the grave of W.W. Poole like shadowy claws. The first bit of the legend has to do with those W's in his name. As Richmond Magazine explains, quote, "The stark capitals in those words above the tomb's portal and the basic initials WW could, in some suspicious minds, resemble fangs." The magazine also adds that, quote, "It could be that Poole inadvertently aided the spread of this legend due to a life spent as a number cruncher. Spelling out his entire name would require paying the stonecutters more." So, we'll admit that maybe those W's, they do look a little like fangs. And we'll also admit that the design of Poole's tomb might have drawn public interest. It is rather elaborate. And a more contemporary public audience, they likely found the, quote, Masonic and Egyptian elements of the mausoleum a little odd. Plus, having a resting place so near to the campus of VCU, it likely didn't help either. Richmond Magazine reports that students picked up the tale of Poole's grave as a vampire's lair sometime in the 50s or 60s, and they propagated it. Still, though, were a couple of pointy W's really enough to establish a legend about poor Mr. Poole? Well, perhaps not. Except for one strange thing. It's not just a few spooky symbols or a couple of pointy letters that have kept the story of a vampire at the pool plot alive all these years. It's the rumor of a filthy figure, jagged-toothed and with a mouthful of blood, who was seen there in the dark. As far as anyone can figure, the first known reporting surrounding the Richmond Vampire appeared in the 70s, but referenced much earlier tales. According to the Commonwealth Times, it wasn't too long after W.W. Poole's death, 1925, when, quote, the first fanged creature sighting was reported near Poole's grave. That's what the local legend claims anyway. The first Times article, as far as we know, wasn't published until 1976, so it seems that information was based more on rumor than evidence. That 1976 article connected the figure to Poole, explaining that, quote, Mr. Poole is alleged to be a vampire, and that, quote, there seems to be a cult in Richmond that has grown up around him. Now, as far as we know, no literal vampiric cults were formed, thankfully, but there was a concerning amount of activity and interest regarding Poole and the alleged Richmond Nosferatu, and that eventually led to damage and mischief that the city and the cemetery wished to avoid. According to Richmond Magazine, quote, during the mid-1980s, the cult of Poole reached something of a New Orleans fanaticism. The iron door of his crypt got jimmied open, and fanciful occultists inscribed words and symbols on the outer chamber's walls. Fetishes are still dropped by the gate with some regularity. The glass of the window on the inner wall shattered, presumably from the inside. And even the VCU students, not involved in the mischief, they kept the story alive. The university was the perfect place to stir up the legend, again and again until it was solidified. W.W. Poole was a vampire, and the proof was the bloody figure who'd been sighted near his grave. It sounds fanciful, we know, but there are those who claim that there could be some truth to it. You see, strangers, there could have conceivably been a figure seen in the Hollywood Cemetery in 1925, the year that some claim that those stories first emerged. But it wasn't W.W. Poole. He was just unlucky enough to be attached to a story that had nothing to do with the paranormal, and perhaps everything to do with a real-life tragedy. According to the local NPR station, in October of 1925, a train tunnel that had seen plenty of problems, the Churchill Tunnel, collapsed in Richmond, with workers still inside. Several men died, and others were missing in the devastation. At least 200 had to crawl through the darkness to escape and emerged battered and bleeding and dirty from the wreckage. We didn't see any concrete reports of survivors emerging in the cemetery, but you know how the stories go. They change. A tour guide who works at the Hollywood Cemetery told the Commonwealth Times that the tale is most likely a sort of amalgamation, a kind of, quote, game of telephone that most likely started from a sighting of an injured individual with blood on their face, broken teeth, and other injuries after that Churchill Tunnel collapse. The tour guide, Chris Houlihan, told the paper, quote, that story gets relayed from one person to the next. All of a sudden, you go from an injured individual to there being a vampire. And the stories that are told now are pretty wild. Per WWBT, it's not just that a bloody creature appeared after the collapse. It's that the legend has morphed to claim that, quote, he was feasting on the bodies from the deadly accident. The news station reports that, quote, some say the bloody creature made a run for it toward the James River, and after being chased, disappeared into the mausoleum of W.W. Poole in Hollywood Cemetery, thus neatly closing the circle to tie in poor old Mr. Poole. Who or what would have created a vampire in a tunnel collapse? That's never explained. Did a vampire already exist down there? Was a worker somehow transformed? That does not meet the criteria of any myth we've ever encountered, but some do think it was a particular laborer who inspired the story, a fireman named Benjamin F. Mosby, who initially escaped the collapse, but was grievously injured. Per NPR, he was, quote, severely scalded by the steam. Mosby's injuries, they were horrific, and they were well documented too. He was, as far as we know, the only person who was so wounded to actually escape the collapse. He later died of his injuries, and he was himself laid to rest at Hollywood Cemetery. The description of this so-called vampire, it could match up with the extent of Mosby's wounds. But did anyone back then think that Mosby was a vampire? No, they did not. None of the source materials support that, at least. In fact, no vampire sightings popped up in 1925 at all, at least in what we've been able to access regarding that collapse. From what we've uncovered, modern historians believe that the specific connection between Mosby and that figure seen near Poole's grave was made much, much later, in the 1980s, when the height of interest in the Richmond Vampire reached its peak. It seems like a retroactive explanation for a myth that has swirled around, looking for roots. These two stories of Hollywood Cemetery, of a guardian dog for a little girl, and of an undead ghoul who might or might not be an accountant, or maybe the vampiric survivor of a large-scale tragedy, they feel at odds, don't they? One is comforting, and the other is threatening, or weird, depending on which theory of the vampire you subscribe to. But that's the thing about stories that are all twisted up in history. A garden-style cemetery in Virginia can become home to just about any legend that its locals can dream up. The game of generational telephone, it can create a loving guardian out of a cast-iron newfie and a monster based on what might be nothing more than a suspiciously carved couple of W's on a spooky-looking mausoleum, with a local tragedy postscript thrown in for full effect. But that's how it is everywhere, isn't it? A place as big and beautiful and historical as this Hollywood, the other Hollywood. It's simply a setting where, well, a different sort of dream is born. We hope you'll join us next time for another real-life story from the fine print of America's local papers. From the lives of regular people, just like you and me, except for one strange thing. Strangers, we've launched a Substack to tell more stories of the weird that aren't quite long enough for the podcast. Some posts are paid, some are free, but you need to be a subscriber to get them delivered right to your inbox. So follow the link in our show notes to sign up for more content. It's like a newsletter, but more fun. One Strange Thing is an independent podcast. To support the show and to hear more of the entirely true and enticingly peculiar, you now have 3 options to enjoy 2 extra bonus episodes a month. On Apple Premium and Supercast, you can get the bonus episodes delivered to your app of choice for just $2.99. And for $2 more a month on Patreon, you'll get more fun extras. There you'll find ad-free early releases of our regular episodes, 2 full-length bonus episodes, monthly giveaways, and blog posts, all for $5 a month. We hope you'll check out one of these options and support the show. There's a link in our show notes. And if you enjoy One Strange Thing, please take a moment to leave us a great rating or review on your favorite podcast app. It really helps. This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Did you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.